Hi everybody, Joseph here with Bean to Bar World. Today I'm going to talk about cocoa butter and rancidity. So I saw a story on Instagram referring to an article that was referring to a certain research article. And so I was curious and I looked into the research article. It's quite insightful. And apparently there's some people out there who are saying that they can taste rancidity in their chocolate and they're wondering if it had to do with storing the chocolate. The article that referred to the research paper that I'm going to go over here now with you, I feel it didn't really quite do the paper justice. So I'm going to go over the research paper here with you, show you the results, and then you can make your own conclusions from there. So the article is called Volatile Compounds of Oxidized Cocoa Butter. The purpose is to evaluate the oxidative behavior of cocoa butter. So there's some people saying that cocoa butter can't go rancid, or it's very rare for it to go rancid, and that's not necessarily the case. Liquid fats will go rancid much more quickly than fats that are solid at room temperature, that's true, but it doesn't mean those room temperature solid fats will not go rancid. The auto-oxidation of refined and non-refined cocoa butter samples was accelerated using either daylight or heating it up to 90 degrees Celsius. Now, when they say refined, they mean deodorized. And when they say non-refined, they mean non-deodorized cocoa butter. So the deodorized cocoa butter or the refined cocoa butter went through a process where it used steam to remove a lot of the aroma compounds to make more of a tasteless cocoa butter. The oxidation stability of cocoa butter was evaluated over a 12-week period. The influence of the presence of an antioxidant or pro-oxidant, iron and copper, on the formation of aldehydes was studied. So they measured the level of aldehydes, which were various compounds that gave the cocoa butter weird off flavors, rancid flavors. Let's read about oxidation here. Oxidation of unsaturated fatty acids is a chain reaction which starts by the production of free radical when a lipid reacts with oxygen in the presence of a catalyst. The catalyst can be light or metal. The free radical reacts further with oxygen to produce a hydroperoxide and another free radical, and the chain reaction has started. The hydroperoxides break down to give strongly flavored oxygenated molecules, resulting in rancidity. So keep in mind that cocoa butter is made up of 3 fatty acids, palmitic, stearic, oleic, but there is a small percentage of cocoa butter that's made up of a different arrangement of fatty acids. It could be stearic, oleic, oleic. It could be palmitic, oleic, palmitic, I think is another one. There's quite a few. It's a very small amount. The reason why I do this is it's 3 chains of fatty acids that combine to create the cocoa butter molecule. But just keep in mind that there is a little bit of other arrangements of fatty acids in there as well. The purpose of this research was to study analytical methods which could assess the oxidation stability of cocoa butter and the evaluation of the volatile compounds, essentially the aldehydes formed during the oxidation of cocoa butter. So there were some ideas out there that cocoa butter can't oxidize. And that's not the case here. And the fact that they accelerated it with daylight and high temperatures for 12 weeks doesn't mean that it has to require really high temperatures and extreme conditions to oxidize. They just needed to accelerate it for the purpose of the experiment. They're not going to wait a year or whatever it is. So let's look at material and methods. So again, the cocoa butter refined, which is deodorized, and non-refined, non-deodorized, was purchased from cacao berry. The different samples were oxidized either in the oven at 90 degrees Celsius, so oxidized using heat, or exposed to daily light at room temperature, so using sunlight for 12 weeks. And then there was also some refined cocoa butter that had some compounds added to it, some antioxidants, 100 parts per million, and then 1,000 parts per million, which is sort of interesting to see what happens, as well as copper and iron for some samples. So now if you read up on volatile compounds of chocolate and cacao, it's good to become familiar with gas chromatography and mass spectrometry. You'll see that a lot. I'm not going to go through it here, but essentially they use a process to extract these molecules and then identify them using chromatography or mass spectrometry. We have figure 1, A and B. A is the non-refined cocoa butter, right? So non-refined means non-deodorized. It's just pressed from the cocoa beans. And you can see obviously here there's a lot of different volatile compounds. The refined cocoa butter, which had most of these removed, you can see obviously it's going to have a lot less of these corresponding compounds, volatile compounds. Now, if we go to figure 2, this shows the chromatogram of the volatile components extracted from the oxidized refined cocoa butter. So here was the regular cocoa butter that wasn't rancid, that wasn't oxidized. And now compare that to the one that was oxidized. Look at all these peaks in the different compounds. The results showed that the refined cocoa butter contained less volatile components than the non-refined, right? So we saw that already. And an important step in the refining of cocoa butter is the deodorization. Deodorization removes the low molecular weight fatty acids and other volatile impurities from the cocoa butter. And so that's why this cocoa butter has a lot less volatiles compared to the non-refined. So here is a chart. Table 1 is volatile components identified. So these were different components identified in both the non-refined and the refined. So again, the non-refined is going to have higher concentrations of many various compounds, whereas the refined, which was deodorized, obviously you can see has less compounds, less levels, some of them just trace, some not even found at all. Table 1 shows the different identified volatile components in both cocoa butter, refined and non-refined. We saw that. Table 2 shows the identified volatile compounds of the oxidized refined cocoa butter. So let's look at this one. This one's a bit more interesting. So table 2 is the refined cocoa butter. So this is cocoa butter that already had most of the aldehydes and the volatile compounds removed. So it was tasteless in a way, flavorless in a way. But this one was oxidized. This one was forced to go rancid. And you can see the concentrations, parts per million, is much higher here in the various compounds. And some of them are extremely high. So I highlighted some of those. The heptanol, octanol, nonanol, octanoic acid. And I wrote next to them generally what flavors, aromas are associated with that. So the heptanol is, oily grease. Octanol doesn't sound very bad. Fruit, citrus, grass, fatty, waxy. And we have grease, grass, unpleasant, and then rancid, right? And these are high levels. So this is what happened after the treatment. Okay, so let's look at a few more figures here. They're highlighting some of the main aldehydes here and putting it on a graph for you. This figure 3, which are these two graphs, is aldehyde concentrations in oxidized cocoa butter stored in daylight versus figure 4, aldehyde concentrations in oxidized cocoa butter stored at 90 degrees Celsius. So they do go on to say that the temperature impact on the oxidation was much greater than just the light itself. It seemed to have a much overall greater impact on creating more of the volatile compounds you don't necessarily want, the ones that don't smell or taste very good. Now, what's interesting here is figure 5 was, remember I mentioned earlier, there were samples where there was antioxidants added. Now, that's an important point because when you're dealing with chocolate bars, let's say you have your single origin chocolate bars, maybe some milk chocolate bars too, you have the cocoa butter, but you also have the cocoa solids, which are packed with the tannins, the polyphenols, and that reduces the rate of oxidation, right? I mean, the reason why chocolate is promoted as a health food by some is the high levels of antioxidants. So if you have a fat that's going to oxidize, well, if it's in the presence of antioxidants, chances are it's going to slow that oxidation down. So I saw something in the article about how because of the types of fatty acids that cocoa butter is made up of, that it's not really going to go rancid. And that's not really the case. They can still go rancid. The reason why cocoa butter or your chocolate bars don't go rancid, the cocoa butter in it doesn't go rancid, is because of the high levels of polyphenols, of tannins that prevent it from doing so. And from the research here and other research as well, you always see that that's probably, they suggest that's why it's not going rancid. It's the high levels of the tannins, of the polyphenols. And if you've worked as a chocolate maker, chocolatier, and you've had products on the shelves, I've experienced this myself, you have your, even if you have in those cello bags where, light's still coming through, and you have a shop and it might not be in direct sunlight, but there's still light coming through. The milk chocolates, the dark chocolates don't really change for weeks and weeks and weeks. The white chocolate products, which don't have any tannins in there, even if it's not even a basic white chocolate, it could be a strawberry white chocolate, it could be that ruby chocolate, it doesn't have those tannins, it doesn't have the polyphenols. It's just the cocoa butter and the sugar and usually the milk powder as well. Those do go rancid. The color changes very quickly, the flavor changes very quickly, and if you have it on the shelf a bit too long, too much light directed there, it's not going to taste good. And you won't have that same effect with the dark chocolate and the milk chocolate products. So let's look back at the paper here. We have the graph here. We have A is 100 parts per million of this antioxidant with daylight, and then the same antioxidant at 90 degrees Celsius. Now you might say, well, this graph looks similar to these. But look at the parts per million. Here we're looking at up to 400 or 500, maybe 600 parts per million. With the antioxidant added, boom, look at that. It doesn't even reach 40. Here it doesn't even reach 100 parts per million. Now, one interesting thing, which will kind of confuse things a little bit, is that if you added 1,000 parts per million of this antioxidant, it actually increased. It wasn't a direct relationship where the more you add of this antioxidant, the less it's going to oxidize. There was a point where if you add too much, it starts to increase. Not as much as without the antioxidant, but still quite a bit. So that's sort of interesting. And it didn't really go into why that might be. I'm not sure if some people did some more research on that in the future, but that's an interesting point. Here we see the quantity of total aldehydes produced at 90 degrees Celsius was higher than their quantity produced in daylight at room temperature. So again, that increased heat, 90 degrees Celsius, seemed to break down the cocoa butter much more than light did. And you can experience that at home when you're cooking with fats. You fry with them, you heat them up, they break down a lot faster. And then we see here a high concentration of the antioxidant could react as a pro-oxidant and not as an antioxidant product. So that's a bit interesting there. So in conclusion, the study has shown that the oxidation of refined cocoa butter was accelerated by the heat and the presence of trace metals, iron and copper, which I'm not going to go into here. The concentration of the antioxidant plays an prominent part in the formation of aldehydes. Certain measures could be taken to inhibit the lipid oxidation during the storage of this product. So, here from this sentence here, they're acknowledging that cocoa butter can go rancid over time. The reason why I wanted to point this out, when you're reading articles that reference research articles, nobody's perfect. And it's important to, if you have an opportunity, to go to the source, read what they had to say. And this is just in general. Like if you see on the news, people are talking about coffee is good today and tomorrow coffee is bad for you. They quote a little line in a research paper, and a lot of times that's there for clickbait, or that's there because they didn't really quite understand the research article. So it's always important to go to the source and see what were the researchers saying. Researchers, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them are very sensible people, level-headed, try to be unbiased. And so a lot of times when you read the research, you'll say, well, the information we have suggests this might be a possibility. We don't know the mechanism behind it, why it's happening, but this is what it shows. But then other people or the media might take little clips from that and say, this is what they said. And you read it, it's like they didn't actually say that. They're suggesting this idea. They're saying, this is the information we have. We don't know 100% if this is accurate or what the mechanisms behind it are. So all that to say that, if there are people out there, and I'm surprised to hear it too, but if there are people out there saying that they're tasting their single origin chocolates, for instance, and they're saying they're picking up rancidity, where is that idea coming from? Is it sort of some new fad, sort of like minerality in wine, where Some people might say it because it sounds sophisticated, even though they don't really taste it or they don't really understand anything behind it. Maybe that's the case for some. I don't want to say. I don't know. But it could be that they are picking up some rancidity. And keep in mind that if you have your single origin chocolate bars, you can have them for years. And if you store them properly, in my experience, they're not going to go rancid. I'd be very, very surprised if they did. But it doesn't mean that necessarily these people are not picking up some rancid flavor. So where might that be coming from? Well, it could be the added cocoa butter. Most chocolate makers add a little bit of cocoa butter. What is the source of that cocoa butter? How is the cocoa butter stored, either at the distributor or at the chocolate maker? And even if it has not gone rancid, because it takes a while for cocoa butter, especially if stored properly, to go rancid, maybe it wasn't stored properly and it absorbed some flavors in the room. Maybe it wasn't stored well at the distribution center and it absorbed some flavors. Not all cocoa butter is always sealed airtight in containers. Also keep in mind that the sources of the cocoa butter. There is a manufacturer in the States who makes chocolate bars. I'm not going to say who it is. I can't eat their chocolate anymore because regardless of the origin, regardless of it's flavored or not, it always has this weird soapy taste to it. And I know it's from their cocoa butter. Why else would every single origin and flavored bar have that same flavor in it? They're using a cocoa butter source that I don't consider very good. Maybe I'm just picking up certain flavors that maybe some other people are not. Could be that. I don't know if it's rancid per se. It could just be a quality of cocoa butter that has aromas. A non-deodorized cocoa butter has aromas that just for me are not very pleasant and I could really pick it up. And also keep in mind too, that anyone who's tasting chocolate, whether you're a beginner or seasoned or whatnot, what you articulate in your mind might not be correct. So I had a tasting the other day and it was, I think, a son-in-law and a father-in-law or something. And they were debating. The father-in-law said, I taste smoky in this. And the son-in-law corrected him and he said, no, it's not smoky. It's toasty. Those are different. And the father-in-law said, actually, yeah, you're right. It's not smoky. But, as a beginner, finding the right word to associate with certain flavors is very challenging and takes a lot of time. So some of these people who pick up on rancidity, maybe they're picking up on some other off flavors. Maybe the combination of the flavors in those bars are, in their brain, it goes to rancidity for some reason. And rancid can taste different with different fats. It can taste stale. It can taste soapy. It can taste different things. So, I don't think we can be so flippant about saying, someone's a snob because they say they pick up rancidity in their chocolate. Maybe they are. There's a lot of chocolate snobs out there. But maybe there is a reason why. Maybe they're tasting that brand that I was talking about and it's just every bar tastes terrible. But all that to say that in the article, I do agree with the fact that it's said that, chances are, if you're storing your chocolate bars at room temperature or in a fridge, if it's kept in a cool, dark place, it's not going to go rancid. A dark chocolate's not going to go rancid. And I would say that's true. I mean, I haven't tested keeping a chocolate for, say, 5 years or more, whether it's opened or not. So I can't really attest to that, but I would be very surprised. The flavor would diminish over time, especially if it was opened at one point or it wasn't vacuum packed. The flavor will change, will diminish. But will it go rancid? That's not something I've experienced. But to say that cocoa butter can't go rancid, from what the information I've read, it doesn't indicate that is the case, especially if it's cocoa butter stored on its own or in the presence of white chocolate. And cocoa butter is a topic that I think we don't talk about enough, especially because it's added as an ingredient to chocolate bars. So when I'm doing my tastings, I try not to give too much information to everyone. So I say these bars are essentially 2 ingredients, cocoa bean and sugar. They have a little bit of extra cocoa butter, but it's not impacting the flavor that much. And in most cases, it doesn't. But it definitely can impact depending on the cocoa butter you're adding, how much you're adding, the source of that cocoa butter, how the cocoa butter was stored, and possibly if it was rancid or not. So keep that in mind, something to think about moving forward. If you enjoy me reviewing research articles like this, let me know, because this is something I do on my spare time. I feel like it might be a bit dry and boring for people, but honestly, this sort of stuff is the most interesting aspect of chocolate, other than perhaps classes and tastings and things like that. So let me know if you like this, and I'll be happy to do more reviews of research articles. I used to do blog reviews of articles, a bit time consuming, but I'm happy to do more videos of it if people are interested. All right, talk to you soon. Download the free Bean to Bar app to connect with incredible chocolate makers from around the world. Also, be sure to visit beantobarworld.com, your portal for all things fine chocolate, virtual tastings, free learning resources, research, and much more. Subscribe to the newsletter to stay in touch, and donate to the free app and free resources here. Contact me for any chocolate-related questions you may have.